Petra Artemis Saltzman studied her reflection in the vanity mirror for a long time. She adjusted and readjusted the cloche hat that sat slightly askew atop her head. Petra wore her hats on an angle. To her friends and family, she claimed it was because it was fashionable, but in truth, it was a distraction from her left ear, which was almost imperceptibly smaller than the right. It was a difference that she had never noticed until her father pointed it out, and one she had not forgotten since. With her thumb outstretched, she measured the arch of her freshly plucked eyebrows, her deep red dress hanging from her thin frame, heavy with lace and beads and ornament. She closed one eye and stepped back with impatience before letting out a frustrated groan and stomping her foot slightly, the click of her high heels echoing across the oak wood flooring of her dressing room and out into the halls of her father's estate. She turned her back to the mirror, then spun back around, smiling, a toothy, disarming grin that showed her dimples. The dull yellow lamplight reflected off of her dress in a million directions. She lifted her glossy black hair with an open palm and rolled her eyes in a hyperbole of charm, letting out a fluttery laugh as she did. She held the pose for a moment, frozen with wide eyes and a toothy grin, like some terrifying department store mannequin. Then she dropped the expression altogether. "God damn it, Petra, you are a hideous bitch," she said, approaching the mirror again, as a long horn sounded out from outside. She turned her attention to her tall window and waited a beat with raised eyebrows, her head cocked. The seconds ticked by. The car horn sounded again, and she nodded and smiled coyly, this time with genuine pleasure as she met her own eyes in the mirror and leaned forward. "Always keep them waiting, kid," she said to herself as she kissed the mirror, leaving a red set of lips, and skipped to the front door. The party was just one in a long line of events she would be attending this year. Her presence as heiress to the infamous Northwestern paper and steel fortune was always requested, and as her father had said, was always required. It would be another night of schmoozing and dancing, and this evening's chaperone, a particularly innocent and somewhat clueless boy named Carter White, son of William White of Lieberman and White and Associates and Co., would accompany her. She greeted him well and with the fiery attitude she had become known for. "Carter, darling, should we have a good night?" she said through the open passenger door, with such excitement he jumped a bit in his seat. "Oh, hey, Petra. Yes, I should say we will," he said as he met her salutation with all the confidence he could muster. Petra was an attractive young woman, with a spark behind her green eyes that burned brightly at even the dullest times. She was rumored to be an excellent shot, an accomplished equestrian, and competitive at billiards, and yet seemed not to define herself with any one specific interest. "Then fire it up, darling," she said as she climbed out of the snowy laneway and into the cab of the vehicle beside the nervous boy. The Coldwell estate was larger than her father's mansion, but much older. The long pebble driveway was flanked with evergreens and had recently been shoveled. Two bundled-up stewards, struggling with shovels, walked the roundabout at the front of the house, desperately trying to keep it clear from the thickly falling snow. Petra and Carter's driver idled at the end of a line of cars, each waiting to unload their passengers at the grand stone walkway leading up to the front door. Just beyond the drop-off point, Petra could see shadows cast warmly upon the snow-covered lawn through the large bay windows that looked into the ballroom. A sea of people, food, and drinks, and Petra couldn't help but sigh. "Something wrong?" Carter said, breaking the silence she had been enjoying since leaving the house. Realizing she had dropped her excited facade, she quickly flashed her toothy grin once again. "Only that we haven't hit the dance floor yet," she said as she hopped out of the car and began walking through the snow, past the line of vehicles and towards the front doors, leaving the muted call of Carter behind in the car. With wet high heels, she entered the large foyer of the mansion and was greeted by Mr. Tate Wilson, Madame Beatrice's kindly butler, who helped her out of her long fur coat and gestured to the large ballroom on the left. "The restroom?" Petra asked, almost in a hushed tone as she gestured to the snow melting in her hair. Making agreeable noises, Mr. Wilson pointed to the sweeping staircase behind him, and she ascended carefully. The second floor of the mansion was dimly lit and reminded her of a cathedral complete with red carpet down the center. Oil portraits and massive gilded picture frames hung thickly on the walls. It was much colder up here, and eager to return to the warmth of the party downstairs, she opened the first door she could. The large oak door opened slow and heavy, revealing a study or small library of sorts. For a moment she paused at the doorway. The room had a large wood table with a high-back chair behind it. A fireplace faintly glowed with dying embers. Her eyes scanned the tall bookshelves and the hundreds of bound leather spines that stuck out like thin teeth. She inhaled the dusty vanilla smell of dry paper and sighed before reaching to shut the door, when a voice stopped her.
"You remind me of someone," the voice said, startling Petra.
She gasped and then covered it with a nervous laugh and took a polite step into the study. She spotted an old woman wearing a gorgeous green dress, sitting in the shadow of a corner bookcase in an armchair near the cooling fireplace. Petra placed her hand on her chest and apologized. "I'm so sorry, darling. I thought this was the bathroom," she said with a laugh. The woman didn't stir. Her cold gray eyes were hazy and slow.
"You remind me of my niece,"
she slurred. Petra smiled nervously. "Well, thank you. She sounds like a lovely person."
"She's dead,"
the woman said, and hacked out a clotted laugh. Petra took a timid step backward, confused. "Your niece is dead?" The old woman's eyes focused on Petra, gluing her to the spot. She studied Petra's face for a minute, then her attention drifted up towards the ceiling and away from her, a confused expression on her lined face.
"No, my niece isn't dead,"
she said to the chandelier. Petra frowned in confusion just as Mr. Wilson materialized behind her, clearing his throat.
"Madam Beatrice, can I get you anything at all?"
he asked kindly, and she waved a hand at him to leave. He took Petra by the elbow and guided her out of the doorway and into the hall. In the hallway, he turned and shut the study door softly, looking back at Petra. He took a moment and then simply shook his head slowly. She smiled with sadness, and the two headed back downstairs. As they descended, the warmth of the party and the music slowly began to wash over her once again, and by the time her foot touched the marble floor, she felt back to her old self. With a large smile, she moved towards the hall and was greeted by the roaring music and multi-hued, shimmering dancers. The black and white ballroom was filled with people laughing and singing, and a light blue cloud of good cigar smoke. The popping of champagne corks was barely audible over the uproariously good time unfolding before her, and just as she was about to enter, she paused. Something felt different. To many people, the scene before her depicted the apex of life. Lavish people enjoying the prosperity of their lavish lives. It was much of what the world yearned for, and what many strived for, and yet she felt a tug in the pit of her stomach. She stood, frozen in the open double doorway to the ballroom as people streamed by her. A female voice called to her from somewhere in the fray, and someone put a champagne flute into her hand. She watched the bubbles float and burst. Then she numbly retraced her steps back to the front foyer and sat down on the steps by the front door. Feeling the prickle of being watched, she looked back at the darkness at the top of the stairs to see Madame Beatrice, her hand resting on the banister, her cloudy gray eyes steady.
"Would you like me to call Mr. Sims to come pick you up, Miss Saltzman?"
said Tate Wilson, his voice like a beacon back to the present. She looked back to him with wet eyes and nodded softly. On the car ride home, she sat quietly and looked out the window at the falling snow as it streaked by in dizzying shards. The engine hummed beneath her loudly, like the growl of a creature waiting to strike. Her mind followed the sound of the beast's growl away from the Saltzmans and the Coldwells of the world, away from the snow and the ice, away from the earth and past the moon and stars as it carried her farther and farther away, her heartbeat faster and faster. In the void beyond the stars, she saw blackness, an abyssal, inky nothingness that was vast and endless and indifferent, and she could feel her pulse racing. Her world was without light, without sound, without breath, and yet she could feel something. She could feel something reaching out to her, and for a moment, she reached back. "Everything all right, Miss Petra?" said the driver, Mr. Sims, his voice shattering the moment. "Of course, darling," she murmured, without turning her gaze from the passing world outside. "Never better." Her face empty and expressionless, her mind wandering into the endless abyss, and more occupied than it had been in a long time.
Watch me.